Hello, this is the Niobrara County Library's Oral History Project. It's May 11th to 2020. And today we're interviewing Ann Whitehead.
2022.
Oh, that's right. I'm way behind times. 2022, thank you. And today we're talking to Ann Whitehead, who is a member of the historic Willson family from the area. And we're hoping to hear stories about her and also about her family, stories that she may remember from her father, grandfather, uncles, and so forth. So why don't we start with your earliest memory and tell us a little bit about your growing up years.
My growing up years in this area were principally in Lance Creek from the time I was about 8 years old. And when I was 11, my father was transferred from here. He worked for Continental Oil Company. And we moved many places from that point on. And came back summers. My parents usually spent summers up here at the ranch. And I would join whenever I could. And that continued until actually my parents retired and pretty much came up here, extended their summer a little bit. And then I was transferred by my company from Houston to Denver, and that was nice because it was closer to the ranch. So I would be up here in the summertime for weekends. And so my earliest remembrances of the ranch were not growing up and actually doing things on the ranch. It was mostly my Lance Creek days, and that was when they were experiencing the second, I believe, oil boom. Maybe it was about the third out in Lance Creek. That was a sea of drilling wells, and at night it was lighted up just like a city. I can remember that quite well. It was every direction you looked, there was a lighted oil well.
When would this have been? What kinds of years?
This would have been, oh dear.
Just
pinpointing the years.
No, I'm just wondering the era.
8 years old. Well, it would have been the early 30s, or mid 30s about, going on into 40s about that point. And there were several oil companies, major ones, that were operating out there. And finally the field faded away because they were doing drilling other places, California and Texas particularly, where the markets were more accessible. And the market wasn't quite so accessible up here, even though the oil products were. And I've always understood from people that that's what really closed down the Lance Creek oil field at that point, when they finally shut it down, was the marketing possibilities. And they had, Continental had a production camp where we lived. We were supposed to be in the gas camp because my father's specialty became natural gas. And he was brought and got his job with the company because they were building a gas plant out in Lance Creek. And that's what they did. And later on, he was transferred into Manville, Wyoming, and right down in actually what is now my front pasture. He sold some land to Continental where they built a loading rack, and a pipeline came across the ranch from the Lance Creek field, and he was put in charge of loading oil cars as they came through Manville. They brought a house in from Manville, or from the Lance Creek into Manville, and my parents had the idea of turning it sideways, and they put the door to the living room on the side, and that house is now in Lusk.
Where is it in Lusk?
It is owned by the Modines, and they left the house sideways. They've added to it since then, but they it was not a very large house, so it was good to add on to it.
Mm-hmm. Do you know where that house is in town?
Yes, it's about a block away from the old schoolhouse.
Oh, okay.
And the Modines live there now.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
But Lands Creek was an interesting place, and I remember lots of little school day things. And the school out there was brand new when I started going there. They had just built it.
That's not where the current school is it?
The card school?
The current school.
Oh, the current school. I think the current school was somewhat built around it.
Oh, same area.
No, it's the very same place, because we used to play over a bank that's beside the school right now. That became our recess place, was down over the bank. But when I left then, of course, I only came back on visits, so I'm not an authoritative rememberer of early days on the ranch.
Well, I do have a question about the ranch. There are several. Yes, there was the Running Water Ranch, and then there was what was called the Manville Ranch.
That's where I live.
And where, it's directly west of Manville?
It's adjacent, north.
On the north side?
North side. The house was built by my great uncle, and the house, the Running Water Ranch house, was built by my grandfather. They were built at the same time. They ordered lumber to come from, and I don't know, Oregon or Washington, one of the two. And they had a siding there at the ranch called Willson siding. The lumber was brought in there. And my grandparents were married that same year, which was 1890. And I always felt perhaps they got the first choice of the lumber, naturally, because it was being built as a home for their marriage. And it was a frame house, and lumber, of course, was very scarce. The other house built in Manville is a stone house. And my grandfather and my great uncle worked on surveying crews when they first came out here. And one of the places that they was Fort Laramie. Mm-hmm. And I asked a young lady the other day when I was at a DAR meeting in Wheatland, she is employed there. Somehow it was told to me that the flagpole at Fort Laramie was used as a takeoff point in surveying because it was one of the few things that was an established location out here. She didn't know that, and I don't know for a fact if that's true. But anyway, I think my great uncle kept the buildings there in mind when he built the house, because my house has walls about 16 to 18 inches thick and built of stone. And I think there wasn't quite enough lumber left, probably, when he built his house. And he hadn't married at that point, and he never married during his lifetime. And
well, now I remember reading a story about the lumber arriving at the siding. There was no, they needed to move the train on, and there was no one to unload the lumber. Do you know this story? No. There was, I'm not certain, I think I read it on the historical stuff on the library website, but they said something about the fact that, I'm not sure which of your relatives it was, but they sent a message into Manville saying that they would give anybody who showed up, any able-bodied man, $1 to help unload this. And the whole town showed up, and they unloaded the lumber.
Job quickly done.
Yes. And the train went on its way.
That's a sweet story that I've never heard.
Oh, yeah.
Plausible, however.
Don't know.
Yeah. At any rate, both of those were lovely houses. I say were because the house at the Running Water Ranch has since been taken down, demolished. It fell into sad disrepair. It always had a little more elaborate trim in the, for instance, the framing of the doors. They had these little bullseye at the corners, whereas my house has just very simple framing, but it all fits very well with the stucco and the, you know. So
It was very
simple.
elaborate for the time, though.
Simple. And my house is a smaller version of the house that was down at the running water, which is good because the running water eventually housed my grandfather's family of 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl, so I'm sure they needed all the space they had.
The cabin at the park here was the original cabin at Running Water, is that right?
Yes.
That was replaced in, I mean, it's still there, but they built a bigger house. Is that right?
No, not exactly. They built the cabin in 1880 when they came here. And they lived there for 10 years, and then 10 years later, of course, as I remarked, my grandfather was married and moved into then this Running Water ranch house.
Where was the cabin exactly?
The cabin was a little bit west, maybe about 1 mile to 2 miles west of the house site. And when they gave the cabin to the DAR, my grandmother was a member of that organization. The cabin was demolished, or taken down. It wasn't demolished because they numbered the logs according to the stories. Now, this is what my grandmother told me. They numbered the logs, brought them into town, and stored them. And they had a big picnic, a big event out there when they decided to do this. The taking down was much easier than the putting back up, because my dad said that about 2 years later, finally, they decided they would at last put the cabin up because they'd finally acquired the land for it there in the park. And it ended up that he and my great-uncle George, with the help of a man named Al Runquist, put the cabin back together.
Amazing.
My grandfather had a fireplace put in the far end. The original cabin didn't have a fireplace in it. It was 2 rooms. It was well, actually 3 rooms, because the cabin as it stands right now was divided into 2 separate rooms. And I have a lot of pictures of the cabin and of the interior of it. And it eventually had walls, kind of like sheetrock, but walls put up. It was lath and plaster at that point, of course, so that it looked just like a house on the inside. You didn't see logs.
What was the 3rd room? You said there were 3 rooms.
There were 3 rooms. The original one was, of course, the everything room,
Right.
which was the tiny cabin. And it was built of round logs. The front part of the cabin was built of square. They were shaved into square shapes. And that was a little bit more unusual. The front room, when they added that on the next year, 1881, became, I would suppose, became a bedroom, and maybe a dining room, living room combination. I have pictures of it, and it looks as though there was a large table at one time, because a lot of people were sitting there eating a meal.
In the 2nd room.
In the 2nd room.
And then the 3rd room?
Well, that was the original kitchen.
Oh, the kitchen.
The original cabin.
Oh, I see.
Because the first year, and probably well into the 2nd year, that was the whole cabin was the only building they had to live in. And they had a 3rd partner who stayed with them until, I believe it was 1889. They bought him out. They worked in Cheyenne for a company called Hay and Thomas. And Thomas happened to have the fortune of his uncle being the surveyor general for the state of Wyoming, or territory of Wyoming. It was territory at that time. So he had a surveying contract to do this surveying work, and that's where my great uncle and my grandfather had jobs as surveyors with him.
Right.
And that, of course, stood them in good stead for all their lives. I lost my train of thought kind of here.
I was hearing that.
Back,
No, go ahead.
oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the surveying around the territory probably gave them a lot of opportunity to see good land that they could eventually maybe even homestead on.
Well, that brings up another little story. They took a long horseback trip. Oh, I know, I was talking about I was going to say the name of the man. It was Thor Rasmussen, who was there. They worked together at what was called the Valley Ranch, and that was owned by Hay and Thomas. And that was located apparently south and a little east of Cheyenne. And so when the three men got together and decided to form a partnership, they made a long horseback ride from Cheyenne, and it was 2 years before they actually staked out their property up here in the Niobrara. They went north, and they went on up north to finally Deadwood because they had a brother who had come out in the meantime from Illinois and was working up in Deadwood. And then they swung to the west and went over as far as Lake DeSmet, came back down the trail there that had been created and joined up with the road on back into, which was, I suppose, kind of a trail into Cheyenne. And by then, they were approaching 9 years working, and they were plowing money into a savings account there in Cheyenne in a bank. And they finally got it together in 1880, enough money. They contracted for the sheep, which was at a place just south of Cheyenne, and picked up the sheep actually a month later than they'd hoped. And excuse me, it was getting colder. It was October, and by November is when they were moving north with the sheep. And they had no misadventures along the way until they got to Fort Laramie. And that bridge that still stands there, the Iron Bridge, the sheep refused to go across. And they delayed, I guess, a couple of days trying to get them to go across because they didn't think they would get across the river safely. Turned out they did, because finally one old sheep just jumped in and the rest, of course, followed her. And the men went across on the bridge so they didn't get wet, and they didn't lose a single sheep going across the river.
Amazing.
Yeah, and made it all the way up here, in fact, trailing them. And so that's quite an accomplishment to the beginning of the ranch, was that all those sheep that they had bought.
And they were in the sheep business for, what, a good 10 years? Or
They sold out in 1916.
1916?
And the tariffs became prohibitive to making much money out of sheep at that point. And so they sold their sheep, and in the meantime, they had started buying cattle. So they had a few cows.
And then they went into the cattle business.
And they stayed in the cattle business, registered Hereford cattle. They were very proud of them, and they were very pretty animals. So
yeah, they are pretty. Well, now you had told me before we started here about your first memory out at the Running Water Ranch, was it?
Yes, of the running water. I was a little girl. I must have been about, as I told you, about four or five, I think. They had an ice house that they built, and that ice was interesting because at one time they cut ice down there at the Running Water Ranch, which is halfway between Lusk and Manville. So the weather must have been much colder, and the flow of the water maybe a little deeper, because they furnished ice for an ice house up in Manville, and also filled their own ice house, which was built down on the Running Water Ranch. And my remembrances of my dad, he and my mother were living, we were living at the Running Water Ranch at that time. Going out, and with an ice pick, he would chip off some ice. It was all covered with sawdust.
Right.
And he would chip off little bits of ice, and we'd stand there and suck ice and spit out sawdust. And that is my earliest remembrance and only remembrance of earliest days there.
That's fun.
But there were many things that I wanted him to remember and talk about and tell me about in later years, because his career actually eventually became with Continental. And he returned to the ranch, and he was gifted the ranch where I live by his parents, because his great uncle who had homesteaded there had passed away in 1931. And they gave my father the ranch in 1933. So he's always kept an interest in it. Kept a few cattle with various arrangements.
When did he move back to the ranch? Did he retire from the oil business?
He retired in 1965.
Oh, goodness.
And at that point, he and my mother did come back to Manville, and they did some upgrading to the ranch, and they planned to stay there summers, make it a summer place. And it indeed became a summer place for them. That's what they did. And did that little routine of coming up from Denver, because I had bought a house in Denver when I was transferred up there. So winters they would come down and stay in the house in Denver with me, and then summers at the ranch. And in the meantime, he had formed a partnership in cattle. And so he had a herd of cattle that kept his hand in the business. My father always, of course, knew about running a ranch, but he never physically, continuously did it because he was occupied with another career.
Now, who ran the ranch while your father was in the oil business?
Well, there were various people. Many people have lived in that house. Most of them family members. And he eventually, though, had a partnership with a man, Clifford Parmley. And they had this partnership in the cattle for about 30 years. And so Clifford, of course, kept an eye out. He and his wife, Tilly, lived in the house for about 3 years, and the understanding was that when my father retired, that he and my mother would come back and take over the house because they knew they wanted to live their summers. And so Tilly and Clifford bought a house in Manville where they lived the remainder of their lives. And in fact, their son was gifted in the house, and he lived there for a while. He recently passed away.
Oh, Paul.
So
was that Paul?
Paul Parmley.
Yes. I know that house.
So Clifford was the one who kind of, kept an eye on what was going on and what was happening. And Clifford and Tilly lived in the house for a while. So the house was fortunate in that someone was usually living in it. And that helps a house.
Yes, it does.
But it was closed in the winters, and of course...
That's hard on it.
That's kind of hard on it. But that old house just rose to every occasion, I guess.
Apparently. And your house then, the history of your house is that it was built in
1890. The year my grandparents were married. Both of the houses were built at the same time.
And who's been in that house?
The running water?
No, the Manville house.
Oh, the Manville house. Well, Tilly and Clifford for quite a while.
Oh, I thought that was the running water ranch.
No, they lived in the Manville Ranch.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm confused.
Yeah, they lived at the Manville Ranch.
Oh.
The Running Water Ranch was, I think it was given to my uncle, who was Phyllis's father. I don't know that for sure, whether it was given to him later. But he and his family eventually lived on the Running Water Ranch.
Okay.
On all of their life, and that's where, of course, Phyllis grew up there, except for a couple of years. They lived at the Manville house.
Yes. Yes.
And before that, he and his wife, Marie, lived at his homestead, which is out in an area called Harney, the Harney Gap, out west. And there is land out there still. That I have some land out there.
Oh, goodness.
And I don't remember the arrangement exactly on the Running Water Ranch, but Phyllis's family lived there all the time she was growing up, and her mother and father, until they moved in town and bought a house here in Lusk.
So you were not around here at some key points in history, like during the Depression. You were very young during the Depression.
I was with my folks, and I was with them in Cheyenne at an interim where my dad had come up here to the ranch but didn't stay, and went back and finally found jobs there in Cheyenne. And that's where we were during the Depression. And then he finally got a job back with, not back with Continental, he'd worked with Union Oil before that. He got a job with Continental. And that was at the tail end of the Depression.
What about World War II?
I was living, and they were too, I believe, at that point in Houston.
Oh, goodness. Right.
Because we were over in Mexico Christmas shopping when Pearl Harbor happened.
Oh, my.
And we didn't know what they were saying. We were over in Mexico. And the young man in the shop finally turned to my dad and he said, "They have attacked us."
Oh.
I guess he was thinking that we were all in it together. But that was where they lived during the war.
Well, how about the blizzard of '49? You were nowhere around this area, were you?
I wasn't.
Oh.
No, that must have been a memorable and frightening. Very
you have
frightening.
no stories from your family about the blizzard?
No.
How about, you were here during the flood of 2015?
Yes.
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 And the flood actually didn't affect your house?
No, it didn't.
Because it was,
fortunately, Uncle George built on higher ground. It's up on a kind of a ridge, and it was above, but I saw it all and realized what was going on and knew what was happening. And Manville was very fortunate. It was fortunate. There were no lives lost during that episode because I've never seen rain like that. I sat up that entire night watching the storm. And I have never seen lightning, just continuous, 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 and rain just never ending. It was amazing. An amazing display of Mother Nature.
And then in the morning you got to see the results.
Yes, there was Lake Manville down in the front pasture. And it didn't go away for quite a while. And likewise in Manville, it was, you know, you don't think of Wyoming ever having floods, but
oh, yes.
That was a memorable one.
Oh, yes, indeed. Well, why don't we move then into some of the stories that you have from your father and grandfather and family?
And actually none from my grandfather.
None? Your father didn't pass on anything from his father?
He told stories of what they had done, but I mean, I didn't know my...
Oh, no.
I knew my grandfather, but I have no memories of anything with him because I was very... let's see, he died in 19 35, and my great uncle died in 1931. And at that point, I was pretty young. I was in 35, I was 7 years old. So I knew my grandfather, but I have no remembrances of my great uncle, except I associate a big dog being with him on the front porch of the ranch house.
Which great uncle was that?
The only one I ever knew, really, great uncle George.
George.
And he was the one who built my house.
Yes. Yes.
There was a third brother who lived in Guernsey, Ed.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know him at all. I don't, from first hand.
Of that.
But I know about lots of things about him. He was very fun-loving and very whimsical, kind of, apparently.
But you were old enough to remember your grandmother, though.
Oh, yes, because my grandmother was about 20 years younger than my grandfather.
Mm-hmm. He married late in life, I remember that.
He married a little later. He wasn't an old man by any means, but they had a very romantic beginning. He became, he had something they called Quincy then. It was kind of like asthma. I don't know why they called it Quincy, but they did. And he finally, the only place to go was either to Rochester or, at that time it was Chicago, wherever one went if they really had something seriously medical that they needed help with. So he went to Chicago, to Rush Hospital. And it so happened that my grandmother had graduated from Wolf Hall in Denver, and she went back to Chicago, where she had been raised by a maiden aunt. And she was working at nurses training at Rush Hospital. Mm. And they became acquainted. Mm.
Now, was that Isabel?
And Isabel.
Yes, Isabel.
And I guess love cured him immediately. He got a bad case of it, or a perfectly wonderful case of it. And he came back home, and they were married about a year later. And she was strictly a city girl. She had never lived, and the ranch was totally different to her. But she adapted to it apparently very well.
I was reading a funny story about her making pies. Do you know this story?
She apparently was not much of a cook.
Apparently.
Because she'd always lived with families, and she'd always been in boarding school in Denver at Wolf Hall. So fortunately, my grandfather knew all about the kitchen routine. But she did have one specialty, was donuts. Ah. She knew how to make donuts, and a crazy dessert called blancmange, which was like white seasoned flour almost. But no, she, of course, she managed to raise the boys, but she always had help in the kitchen because there was always usually a wife of one of the men that was working on the place would come up and take care of meals and help in the house, and so she was fortunate in that aspect of housekeeping.
Exactly.
She had plenty of backup.
Well, you have stories that you have brought, notes of stories that you brought.
I wanted to bring a few little notes so that I wouldn't forget.
Right.
At one point when I was living in Denver, and of course I was with my family a lot, my parents, I would ask my father, please, would he tell me some early day, not only stories, but how did they do things on the ranch? How did they, and as I was telling Leslie, he was always interested in today and tomorrow, and yesterday was yesterday, and he had closed the door on that. But once in a while I could get him to then start And once he did, he would tell me a lot about what went on. And I did want to remember to tell some of these things. They had, which was unusual, I guess, in a way, what was called a hydraulic ram water system. And that water system was in place until about a year ago. It works on a principle. It had an air chamber, and somehow or other, when the water comes in, it moves the water then forward as it goes out, and something about the air pressure moves it. It is not fast flowing, and of course it didn't adapt well to modern things like dishwashers and such as that. So it was replaced long ago, and of course the present owners of the ranch, the Nelsons, were very careful to put in things that are very modern use. And that hydraulic ram system was sort of, I guess, left in place, but it never was really formally used.
And it was never used for irrigation. It was just used for household?
Household. Household.
I've never heard of one of those.
That's a good question. I should have asked him. Was it used for irrigation? But I don't think so, because they somehow channeled off, I think, from the Niobrara River that went through the ranch.
Of course.
And sometimes they would, I suppose, just flood the pasture.
I would think.
So,
okay, household.
Good question that wasn't asked.
That's all right.
Then the electric system. Oh, my dad said that about every 15 years you'd have to buy a new rubber valve for that hydraulic system. Other than that, that was the only maintenance for that system. So it was a good one.
Yes.
But
you need more water pressure in the house, apparently.
Yeah. Well, and he said valves are screened on the outlets to the pipes. Very little stuff got in it if you kept a lid on the tank. If you can get a good fall in between your water source and your hydraulic ram, you have a perfect setup. Was his parting word on that.
Good to know.
They had a Delco system, and he said that it was originally bought from Manville.
Just as the electric system?
The Delco, yeah. But they had a little insulated room for storage of the batteries, which were made of glass, down at the Running Water Ranch. And I saw some of those battery storage. They're flat, kind of, out of an auction one time. Those battery storage things. And he said that a Delco system, he said about every week you'd have to run it, which was run by wind power, for about 12 hours to generate electricity that would last about 5 days.
So that would charge the batteries that then you...
Oh, now here answers that some. He said it could pump water to the meadow if you wished.
Oh, very good.
While the Delco was running. So there's maybe where they did use a little Delco power. 1 cylinder, 1 horsepower pump. No way to start the 1 horsepower except with a handle on the side. That's my phone. We'll ignore it.
Okay.
The next one is the buck rake. And it was designed to pick up hay from the meadows, and Uncle George loved to do that. My dad said he always loved to rake. And that brings up an interesting idea or thought, too, of what they had in the way of help. People used to go through the country with crews that did haying.
Yes.
And oftentimes they had people do that. Kind of like people come through and cut grain nowadays. They came through and did haying, and my dad said they would set up with tents and put everything up around, and he said it was always a sea of tents with all these people
like
that came. Yeah. And the hay, he remarked that his uncle liked to do haying and often did, even though they contracted with outfits that came through. And he gave a detail of how the buck rake worked, which I won't go into detail, but it produced hay. And when they produced hay, he said they put up 150 to 200 tons of hay each season.
Mm-mm.
And the barns were first, and they filled them. Then the meadows where haystacks were built. The west meadow, finally over-irrigated up by the cabin, was put into stacks, 2 stack yards ordinarily.
Mm.
Both stacks yards took care of the hay in that meadow. The hay they got out front of the house filled the barns.
Goodness, so they didn't bale, they just did haystacks?
They did haystacks. There was no baler. There were no balers.
So it was all loose hay in the
I don't know
barn.
when balers came in, but it was loose hay, which of course required a lot of men, a lot of manpower. Then they stored the hay in the barn, and that system is still there, and it is, Rod said it's still there. They would bring the hay in from where it was cut, put it into kind of a canvas, a sling thing. They would bring that over to the front of the barn. Said the team of horses would be out in front of the barn, hitched up with an attachment to the sling. Okay, the sling full of hay was a device to hold the hay while it was lifted up to the loft and carried into the barn. And apparently when it would go up, there was a clicking arrangement that would change the direction of it, and it would go down.
Oh.
There were a couple or 3 men in the barn
Oh.
when the hay was released onto the floor of the attic up there in the barn, the hay storage. Then the men would immediately start stacking it.
Let's take a pause